All right, this is reading mock version 5. Gonna try to keep this short. Most of you, by the time you get to reading mock 5, although this may eventually be one of the earlier ones that some of you run into, you're kind of hopefully getting pretty good at your strategies and you mostly want the answers. There are some things definitely in this form that I do want to point out or that I do want to talk about. And I'll try really hard not to get lengthy with that, but at the same time to give you any bit of information that I have that might be helpful. Lots and lots of stuff in here that you could see in one form or another. I will do the same disclosure here that I typically do at the beginning of a mock. This is designed to simulate the test in every possible way that is also ethical and that is also conducive to a long-lasting career for me. So there are not copyright violations in this mock whatsoever, but it is designed to simulate the test. So there are passages in here that will definitely seem like they're familiar when you get to the test. They are definitely redesigned from what they actually are when you see them. So they are not the same passages. Content-wise, you'll get the same idea. You could say the gist is the same. So that you kind of have already thought about some of this content, and that just helps your thought processes be a little bit quicker when you get there. But some of the structures are different. Certainly the detailed things like the sentence structures and the descriptions and the word choices and things like that are definitely different. And in some cases, the actual structure, some of the bigger structures are different. I might have something that's 3 paragraphs. They might have the same thing in 5. But if there is something tricky about a particular passage, a particular scenario, or whatever, I will do everything I can to point out whatever those things are to try to make sure that you just know to expect anything that might be a little bit weird or a little off the beaten path. This first passage is one that I get a lot of complaints about, which is the one about Frida. And this is essentially, if you didn't notice it as such, if this didn't stand out to you, this is essentially a biography. If you just took reading mock 4, hopefully, if you just took reading mock 4, hopefully this did stand out to you as a biography, because I want you guys to start to recognize that as a passage type. There's a lot of things that we read that are biographies in the TEAS and elsewhere. Biography is the story of someone's life, not told by that someone, but told by somebody else. So this is about her life. It is focused. So when you read the intro paragraph, you'll see that it's not just like a nice sequential thing about her life from beginning to end. It's got some emphasis in a couple of places. They kind of say like, well, she was in a severe accident at one point and then became one of Mexico's greatest artists. So you can see that these are kind of the 2 emphasis points for her life, and that's where they're going to focus. But they do go kind of back to the beginning. They talk about her being a kid, her siblings. Then they talk about her contracting polio, having to rehabilitate from that, then getting into an accident, then becoming a painter. And as an adult and a painter who had some sort of influence in society, also becoming part of a political movement. So all of that was included into essentially a biography about her. So the first question was, which of the following lists the correct sequence of events in Frida's life? Anytime you see like what's the correct sequence, this is summary. And something I've pointed out recently in some of the review type classes and in some of the mocks is if you're asked for a summary, keep in mind that that's pretty similar to being asked what your outline looks like. So if you wrote your main idea and then you wrote your focus and you wrote your focus and you wrote your focus, I don't do those all in the mocks on every one of the passages because it would make my mocks really long. But those are your summaries. So anytime you go to look for a summary, keep in mind you have a summary on your scratch paper and you can use this as an outline for finding the best summary because you more or less have the sort of framework of a summary in what you wrote when you wrote your outline. The only one that is correct in this case, so this isn't one of those summaries that's really narrow, that there's a lot of great choices and you're having to be really, really careful. All of these are wrong in some way. They're all out of order in some way, except for C. The only one you might have gotten confused with might have been A, but this is the wrong sister. It was Christina that would have been born in this spot. So that would be the only thing you could have gotten confused with. And that would be from technically reading 3 because it's summary. As I noted in mock reading 4, a lot of questions come out of reading 1. You could argue that every question comes out of reading 1 in one way or another. Because that's reading 1 has to do with your critical strategy, which has to do with how you outline, which means it also has to do with your summaries. It has to do with essentially your understanding of how the author used their information, their ideas, their focuses, their details, how everything came together. So if something isn't like a big thing that came from a big class, like if something is about text structure, then it definitely came from reading 6. If something is about summary, it definitely came from reading 3. But if it's not like that and it doesn't have a very exact spot that it came from, I will say it's from reading 1. And I'm not saying that we did exactly a lesson on it. I'm just saying that it would have to do with your thinking about how the author was using their ideas and their details to put together some work. So I'll add 1 to a lot of things, and I'll always say 1 if there's not exactly a particular place that something came from. Which of the following describes the author's tone in the passage? Tone is from reading 1. We do talk about tone. It's how the author kind of speaks about or feels about something. Most people on this one, and you could have done it differently than this, most people kind of get rid of tragic because it's not talked about like it's tragic. It has a happy tone despite the fact that there are some bad events. It is happy despite that. So usually people get rid of tragic. That kind of leaves you with reflective, formal, and nostalgic. I find a lot of people torn between any combination of these. Reflective is the next one that I would take out because reflective tends to be like the person themselves. So this is not Frida writing this. In other words, this isn't first person. Typically, to be actually reflective, to be effective at reflecting on something, it would need to be someone that was involved. So we can't really call this reflective because nobody that we're talking about here is involved in telling the story. That would leave us with nostalgic and formal. Nostalgic is defined as like making you almost want for the past. The way that the definition actually looks, if you look it up, is yearning for the past. So making you want to go back in time. So like they'll say that something like a Super Nintendo console is nostalgic, or like an old movie is nostalgic. So it makes you want to go back to that point in time. So although this could be thought of as maybe a teeny tiny bit nostalgic because it's talking about the past, and it's a teeny tiny bit reflective because this is someone who overcame some struggles and kind of went from this normal person to this person who got badly injured to this person who was really famous. Both nostalgic and reflective. If you noticed any property of either of those, it was very, very little. Really, ultimately, this is a biography, and it's written in third person, and really, ultimately, it was just written formally. So there may have been a hint of some of these others, but again, it's always main. The word you always want to use if you're having trouble sorting through anything is main. Main purpose, main focus, main idea, main tone. You can use main anywhere you're having a problem. So what was the main tone. It was mainly formal. In which of the following sources would the reader most likely find the passage? Again, biography. So keep front of mind here that this is a biography. This is a third-person account of someone's life. Where you would find that would probably be an encyclopedia about her. So this is somebody that's notable in history. We've seen this before. We've seen this in at least one other mock, if not one or two other mocks, where it's about someone's life, and it's always about someone's life that's not super boring to where their life story doesn't quite sound like it comes out of an encyclopedia, because they have kind of an interesting life story and it sounds a little bit tricky and a little bit complicated. But if it's somebody's biography, you would find somebody's biography in an encyclopedia entry about that somebody. This is definitely not a newspaper article about her death, because if it was, that's what it would be talking about, is her death. This is not about her death. It's definitely not a museum exhibit, because it's not about her art, it's about her. And then this says a book about art. Again, this is not focused on her art, it's focused on her life story. So anytime you pick up that something is a biography, even if it's got a bit of an abstract feel to it, it is from an encyclopedia. That gives you a lot of info. One of the things is still coming up, so I'll mention it in a second. And so that would be, I guess you would say that comes out of reading 2 to be able to identify where it would come from. A student wants to learn more about Frida's political activities. To which of the following articles should they refer? So this is just about being specific here. Her political activities, you would want to refer to something that is political. She was in the Communist Party. So notable members of the Mexican Communist Party would be where you would go. The Cold War would be unrelated to her, because she was not part of the Cold War. The complete works of Frida would be her art, not her political. And then this one would be presumably just about her in general. So this one relates her to her husband, and it doesn't say whether it's about her art or whether it's about her. And if something doesn't specify what it's going to be about, you would assume it's just going to be about that person in general. So this is completely off. B is completely off topic. C would be about her art, and D we would assume would be about her, but we would certainly not have evidence to say it would be about her political involvement. You need exact evidence to say something is related to something that's really specific. 5, which of the following describes the passage type? Again, biography. So we identified very early on, hopefully mock 4 helped you with this. Hopefully as soon as you read this, you were like, oh, this is one of those biographies. That tells you that it is informative / expository, because they're the same thing. It tells you that it comes from an encyclopedia. It tells you it's an informative. It tells you that it's got a formal, neutral, third-person tone. So knowing it's a biography tells you all kinds of things, and there are several of them. So it's very, very likely that you will have one of those on whatever test you actually end up sitting down at. Which of the following would be considered a primary source about Frida? This is from reading 2. Both of these are, in fact, all 3 of these are from reading 2. A primary source comes absolutely directly from the person we're asking for a source from. A primary source from Frida has to be something that comes directly from Frida. They only have one example that's there that is directly from her. That's a letter that she wrote to her husband. An encyclopedia entry about her did not come from her. A magazine article about her does not come from her. Same thing with a newspaper article. So unless it was written by her, it would not be primary. Your next article is social media. Pretty long article, several different paragraphs. Hopefully you were really careful with what your main idea was and adapting your different paragraphs, thinking about why they were there. The questions are going to do a good job of making sure you understood why all the pieces were there. So I won't discuss the passage until we do some of these questions, and that'll help us discuss it. So the first question was, which of the following statements best summarizes the conclusion of the passage based on the author's evidence? This is like a weird combo of a main idea question and a summary question. So they're essentially kind of asking you for the main idea, kind of sort of asking for the summary, which can be similar concepts. Sometimes a summary would be a little longer and more inclusive than a main idea, but they are ultimately going to have a lot of crossover. So I guess you would say this is from reading 1 or 3, however you want to kind of picture it. And like with anything that comes out of reading, it's always going to depend on what our answers are. So we want to best summarize the conclusion of the passage. You conclude reading the passage, what best summarizes what the passage is. And this one's going to be C, which says readers should look to multiple sources to verify the news. That doesn't jump out as like, whoa, that's perfect. The second that you read it, it looks okay. It looks like it is in line with what the author thinks, but none of the other answers work at all. So you have A says readers should avoid news stories shared via social media. That's too strongly opinionated. The articles, you can't summarize the conclusion that the author made by saying you should avoid social media news completely. That's not what they said. You can't say that social media causes the development of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias already exists within us. Social media is a place where it happens. So that would also be wrong. That would be misusing that definition. And then social media makes it more difficult to find the news. That might have been tempting for a second. Social media's presence, the existence of social media, does not make it harder to find the news. It makes it easier to run across more things that are inaccurate. It doesn't actually make it harder to find it. So that leaves you with C, that you should look to multiple sources before you assume that you have heard the right thing. So that is kind of a combination of the main idea or the summary, or you're also integrating what the author's evidence is showing. So it's also sort of the author's opinion. It's kind of a broad question. It's almost one of those questions that asks you what's true based on what the author thinks. Which of the following definitions best describes the meaning of the word disseminate as used in the passage? That is used right up here, and it is used as to spread news. That's a combination of actually English 1 and reading 1. There is a list in English 1 of the words that you need to know the definitions of. And then in reading 1 and actually also in reading 5, we talk about those. What is the purpose for the discussion of confirmation bias in the second paragraph? So the second paragraph is where confirmation bias is brought up. It's defined. We talk about what it is, how it happens, and how it fits into a social media context. And the question is, why is it discussed in the second paragraph? So the answer to that one is going to be B. You'll notice that again, and this is a really tricky mock test. There's a reason that this is version 5. You have several things going on. So you have purpose here, and you notice that you do have on a couple of these, I guess on one of them really, you do have those little purpose taglines. To explain is a purpose tagline. That said, the other 3 have the word to, but then they're followed by something that is not a correct purpose tagline. that's not your key priority. Your key priority is always going to be the explanation part first. And then you're hoping that your explanatory part will go with something that matches up your passage type here. In this case, it does, because we do want to say it's to explain about social media and how it matches up with that. But we also want to talk about the discussion of confirmation bias and how it fits the passage, which is why social media users are likely to spread misinformation. So this is the connection between what confirmation bias is and why that makes social media users in particular likely to spread misinformation. Not saying that they're likely to be dishonest. It's not saying they're likely to click on a particular thing. It's saying that people are likely to spread misinformation because they're likely to engage with something they either agree with or disagree with in particular. So we'll say that came out of reading 2 because of the purpose element. 10, which of the following statements best summarizes the author's main argument in the passage? Main argument is like main idea. So we'll say that's from 1. Social media can be an unreliable source of information. So we have to be kind of neutral with our main idea, because the author didn't say get off social media. He didn't say social media is always a bad source, nothing like that, but it can be. All the other answers are basically too extreme on this one. So social media is the most popular place to find current news was not spoken about enough that we can say for sure that it is the most popular place. Plus, it's not the point. So even if we did actually know for sure that that is the most popular place, we would need to keep in mind that it's not the main argument. Social media is negatively affected by news media. That would be to say news is badly influencing social media. So that's sort of backwards. And again, not the main argument. Social media is the primary source of misinformation is too extreme. We can't say that social media is actually the problem. We can just say that it is a contributor to the bigger problem that we're talking about. The author provides 2 examples of how people might share satirical news stories because of confirmation bias. What kind of evidence is the author using to support the argument? This is a terrible question, and if I were the writer, I would not have this on there because none of these are good answers. If you don't remember, these are right here. So it says, one story may tell of a far-fetched tale involving the blunders of a politician. Another may promote a story about a scandal that involves a controversial celebrity. These stories are intended as satirical fiction, which exaggerates real issues for the purpose of humor and social commentary. So those are the 2 examples that they're talking about. And so it's kind of tricky to decide on one of these because this really doesn't fit on one of these. So let's take out the ones that definitely don't work. Those are not statistical. So statistical evidence would be to put numerical data in place. That is definitely not numerical data. Testimonial would be for somebody to say, this is something that actually literally happened to me. And it's like a testimony when somebody says, I went to this website and I found this, and here it is, and here's my evidence, or something like that. Anecdotal evidence is when someone tells a story and it's an actual story, it's their story. And then analogical evidence is when somebody makes an analogy. So in this case, the one that's the best is the analogy, because there's not an actual story being told. If they had gone a little further with these, if they had like kind of created a person and said, oh, this person sees this, and then they do that, and they kind of created a little bit of a story behind this example, they might have actually been able to take it to the anecdotal level, but they didn't. So there's not a story behind either of those examples, much less both of them. And so there's kind of a fallback that happens in this. Analogical evidence is considered weak evidence. So anytime that there's really poor evidence in something, it is considered analogical evidence. So if you were to ever have a situation where you were creating some sort of evidence, you were creating a paper and there wasn't good evidence for something, or you were reading something that someone had created and there was really bad evidence in place and there was nothing good to back something up, that's the kind of evidence that you would be citing it as. So in this case, that is the answer that they have in place. So that one would be analogical evidence. I don't expect you to love that. I don't even necessarily expect you to fully understand why they have that way. I just want you to know that and have seen that already and be aware of that. They don't always put that question in rotation, so you could actually get this passage and not get that question. That would be fabulous, of course, if that were to happen. But that is what it is if you do get it. 12 says, which of the following pieces of evidence challenges the author's claim? This is not worded great. What they mean is if all four of these things here are true, which of these four things would challenge the claim that the author is making? So they weren't as clear in their wording as they could be. That is more or less the way it actually is worded, so it's really brief. If they were to say that an online quiz from some sort of reliable source, which is C, demonstrated accurately that social media users are better informed about current events than people who do not use social media, that would argue against the point that the author has made. So this, I guess you would have to say, comes out of reading one, because this has to do with you understanding the way that the author is using their ideas, and their focus is to say people who are using social media are likely to maybe know of some of the things that are going on in the world and going on around them, but to also have some misinformation floating around in their head about what's going on around them, because they're seeing as much incorrect information out there as they are seeing correct. If it were to be found that they have more correct information in their head than people who are not on social media, that would make the author's argument weaker. 13, according to the author, how does confirmation bias relate to satirical news stories on social media? So this is also reading one. It has to do with your understanding of how he used this. And this is going to be B, because it says social media users are likely to click on headlines with which they disagree. If you struggled with this one, you struggled with it because of the disagree. The way that he presented it, if I remember correctly, the way that he presented it in the article was more like you would be likely to click on something you agree with. But it goes both ways, because essentially the thought is confirmation bias means that something you're interested in or that you feel passionately about one way or the other is something that you would be interested enough to click on and that you would engage with. So if you strongly disagree with something, you're likely to click on it. If you strongly agree with something, you're also likely to click on it. All the other answer choices are terrible anyway, so that would help you solidify that if that threw you off a little bit. Social media users recognize that far-fetched headlines are usually from satirical source. That's actually the opposite of what the author's trying to say. He's trying to say that they don't typically recognize that. They typically don't recognize it, and instead they share it without recognizing what they're doing. Social media users might find that satirical news stories can increase confirmation bias. Kind of doesn't make sense. It's not like a social media user is looking for confirmation bias and they have a meter of that can be increased. So that's not using that term properly. And then social media users rarely share news stories that confirm their opinions without verifying the source is definitely the opposite of what the author was saying. The next one is the Chimney Swifts article. I have to be honest, I've gotten this article several times. I knew what the general structure of this article was. I wrote this completely myself. And for whatever reason, I just can't, I can remember the general structure, but I can't remember the way that they get this to flow. So if it felt like it didn't flow and you were having trouble keeping up with the passage because it felt clunky, that's me, because I just, for whatever reason, I could remember what I needed to get across and in what order, but I just couldn't get it to flow the way that they have it flow. So if you do get this on the passage, it'll be a relief because theirs is way better than mine. This is a challenging passage. The questions on this one, I would say, are relatively easy, like in comparison to some of the passages that we just did, and in comparison to a couple of the ones that are in the mock 4. And there are more than what are on here, as is the case with any of these passages. There's multiple question sets for any given passage, so this is just some of them. But I'll explain a couple of things as I run into them in the questions to make sure you have the right idea behind a couple of these. So this is one example I just want to point out of a developing main idea. And you may have realized this while you were in the passage. You may have realized it during your questions. You may be realizing it because I just said that. And of course, the fourth option, because there's always 4 options, is you may realize it after I say this. When I say developing main idea, I'm referencing something I mentioned fairly briefly in reading 1. Some of you really hear it when I say it and you go back and you ask me about it. Some of you don't. And some of you actually don't even realize that I do say it in reading 1 and you're shocked by it if I say something about it later, like when we do tutoring or something. You have to check and confirm your main idea later when you're done reading a passage. So you don't just get your main idea from the intro and call it a day. You have to make sure after you read the whole passage and you get through that final paragraph, you have to make sure that you actually did get the right main idea, because there is a very, very small percentage of passages that will develop beyond the main idea that you saw in the intro. Just a little bit, typically. And this is an example. So if you read this intro, you would say that this is in the 1970s, huge changes to the population of chimney swifts began to take hold. So you would think main idea is changes to the population of chimney swifts. You'd be very close. That is still going to be a great main idea. It's going to allow you to structure this. It's going to allow you to correctly use your structuring strategy, your critical strategy. You're going to go on about your normal strategy. Everything is going to be fine and normal. But you're going to get down here and you're going to realize there's a little more to it. The main idea wasn't just changes to the population are happening or have happened. It's that we can also work to fix them. And the author, in a sense, sat down to write this. So if you kind of combine the main idea with the purpose, the author's purpose was to encourage us to help with this, to make some minor changes to help continue the building of this habitat back up. And we don't see that to here. So normally you would see that in the intro paragraph. Well, it would say, while there have been decreases in the population amongst chimney swifts, they're back on the up because of changes that people have been making. That would be an appropriate thesis. Every once in a while, for whatever reason, an author will decide not to do it that way, and they will leave it out. So right here, they left out the part about improvements being made to help these guys. And instead, they mentioned it here, and you have to put that in your main idea. So when you bump into it there, you kind of have to go back and you have to add it to your main idea. It'll happen just every long once in a while. You'll realize right away, and you'll just kind of add it to what your original main idea was. It's always something that won't affect your critical strategy. You'll go ahead and do your critical strategy. You'll just get to the last paragraph or so, and you'll go, oh crap, there's like one more thing I need to kind of add and adjust. And then when you get to your questions, when you're answering questions about main idea, you'll realize there is kind of something that has to go in there with what you already had. If you have further questions about that adjustment, let me know. You might also clarify that as we go here. What is the purpose of this description in the intro paragraph? And then it's got a quote. So the reason that they did that quote is C, to engage the reader with a vivid description of the birds that are the topic of the essay. So this is out of reading 1 and 2 because it's a little bit of purpose and a little bit of detail. And the reason that it's not A or B, so D would be too generic, not a good enough answer. They're not wanting to show that the birds are intimidating because, as you know, they never did want to make them intimidating. And then they're not trying to emphasize that they travel in packs. If they had gone on to do more with that or say more about that, then that might have made sense. But they really were going to talk about mostly their habitat. So since they ended up just pretty much going on and talking about habitat, we can assume that this was not the goal, that was not the goal. They were just trying to be vivid. What can you logically infer from the passage? The right answer to this is A. There were changes made to the way homes were designed in the 70s. This is because they said that that was when huge changes to the population of chimney swifts happened. Shortly after that, they said the reason that they're called that is because of their habitat. Their habitat is a chimney. And then they said older houses had this type of chimney, newer houses had that type of chimney. And that allows you to figure, oh, older houses must have been before the 1970s. Newer houses must have been during or after the 1970s. Of course, logical conclusion always depends on what your answer choices are. You could have great ones, you could have terrible ones. You can definitely conclude that. B says that the populations will now increase. There are efforts being made by somebody. We don't know if just the author of this particular passage is making an effort or if millions of people are. So we do not have enough info to say that. So that would be too far. Same thing with that they'll continue to decrease. We don't know how many people are making these efforts. So that is too far for what we know. A fake chimney is the best way to help chimney swifts with their habitat. Is again too far. That was one of the ideas. We don't have enough info to say it's the best way. We don't know how many ways there are. We don't know what the best ways are, and so on. What is the main point the author is trying to make in the passage? This is where you had to adjust your main idea a bit. This might have been where you detected that you had to add a little bit to it. So this one you wanted to answer A. Though chimney swifts have had challenges with population decrease, some simple changes on the part of humans can make a difference for the species. They do have the original main idea there, which is choice B. And that was that their population decreased in the 70s. Hopefully you saw that, realized that that had been your original main idea, but hopefully you didn't pick it because it felt like it didn't include the second half. And that's tricky because you did have to make an adjustment. That is very, very rare, but that is absolutely why I have this passage in here. It took me seriously like 2 hours to write this stupid passage in here because I wanted you to see that so that you are aware of that, because it is super rare for those passages to exist. Now you know that if you do get the chimney swift one, it does have an adjustable main idea that you need to know about. Which of the following is the best way to describe the text structure in the third paragraph? So that is this one here. This one is very much comparison and contrast. It goes back and forth. Compare contrast has a very, very flexible back and forth. So you could start with old, new, new, old, 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 new, new. Doesn't matter. You can compare and contrast in whatever rotation you want. So it doesn't have to be so rigid, like problem solution has to be one problem, one solution. Cause effect has to be a cause immediately followed by an effect. Compare contrast is exactly what it sounds like. You can just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So that would mean that that paragraph was exactly what a compare contrast would look like. 18 asked which of the following was the primary overarching text structure throughout the passage. It was really designed, and I'm going to give you a hint, go to the main purpose place for this. The main purpose was problem solution. Problem is the decline in population, and solution is the things that we can do to help. So that would make it sort of a combo of reading 2 and reading 6 because it is text structure, but main purpose is a good way to get there. Mode of the passage was informative. Yes, there was a little bit of persuasion at the end, but that is not what it was written for. It was really written to put the information out there. There was a bit of persuasion at the end. That's why I did this primary overarching and was so emphasized right there with that. And right here with this is to hopefully make sure that you didn't think the persuasion was too over the top, because it wasn't. Really, they set out to inform. They set out to mostly talk about the problem, but offer a quick solution. And that was the overarching main purpose. So that was not supposed to be persuasive. It was supposed to be informative with a couple of mild suggestions at the end. 20, what is the mode of the final paragraph? This question might have caused you to adjust your prior answer. Definitely that last paragraph was persuasive. So you might have answered persuasive and you might have come back up here and said, well, all right, if the final paragraph's persuasive, maybe the whole thing overall was informative. I put those together hoping that that might have that effect. I definitely made reading Mock 5 difficult. If you got some of these wrong, you really shouldn't be discouraged by that. I picked the hardest passages. I put the hardest questions up against the hardest questions. I used moving main ideas. This is designed to be your final stretching your thought processes kind of mock. Graveyard walk. Most of you have read this in class, so I'll fly through these questions. These are different questions. These are the questions I most recently saw. Which of the following could the reader logically infer from the passage? Always depends on the answers, what you can infer. The reason that Stephen experienced fear was because it was nighttime, and we get that from the fact that he goes through that cemetery every day. And this time he's really freaked out, and that's because it's dark out, and normally it's not. So that's because it's nighttime. To be a frightening person is, first of all, an opinion, so that's a problem, and is, second of all, not something we can say about this person that we're not sure who they are. We don't know how much the kids make bets about the graveyard, and we don't know how much these two kids make bets with each other. So all of these things would be too far. And then the next question is, what can you infer from this passage? And that's going to be A, to win the bet, he had to stay for 1 hour, because it says he can keep the wager. An hour in this place isn't worth it. All of the others, this one is stated. Stephen won the bet against David is wrong, is incorrect. And then David also bet the other kids that they couldn't stay. This is too far. You don't know this answer. The next three questions are based on this little paragraph. You'll get at least one or two of these that's just a little paragraph. 23 says, what is the best main idea? So C, maple syrup's distinctive flavor is due to the specific process used to create it. 24, which of the following is a logical conclusion based on the whole passage? And that is B, boiling sap increases the sugar content by increasing the amount of sap that comes from where it says here, the gathered sap is boiled and reboiled until it reaches the ideal sugar percentage of about 18%. Which of the following types of text structure is employed in the passage? This one is actually super weird. I haven't seen one that's like this on the real test. This is one of the official practice passages. I put it in here because of the style. I wouldn't worry about this. First of all, you might have already noticed point of view is not a style. Chronological sequences, problem solution, and cause effect. This is definitely not cause effect. There is no cause and no effect. There is no problem, so there's no solution. So you would say this is chronological sequence. I guess you could say it kind of is. It really didn't feel like it was in sequence. There was only a couple of steps that were. Otherwise, it felt like it was somewhat just random and factual. You might disagree. Maybe I didn't read the thing as thoroughly as you did, but definitely out of the options, there was not a cause with an effect and there was not a problem with a solution. Considering that point of view is not an option, that would put you at sequence. Be very careful with these things because a lot of times there is an answer that seems obvious and then there's one that seems like it's not obvious and you're supposed to pick the one that's not obvious. This one is a very good example, hence how it wound up in here. This says, where should you go when you're choosing colors for a book design? There's three different places that they show color. So there's color, color correction, color palettes. So a lot of people just go for color and they just pick that. Of course, they have that there for you to answer right there. Color correction usually doesn't get picked, but a lot of people just go for color and then that's it. Color palette would be where you would pick color. So you're going to want C for that one, color palettes. These, there's always a trick to these. It's very easy to look up page numbers for something. So be aware that there's probably a trick coming. On these ones where there's like pricing and there's all these things that can be confusing, always have an organized scratch paper plan in place. Be ready to write them down carefully so that you can figure out the numbers. Never try to do these stupid things in your head. Always write them down, do the math carefully, have them in an organized place. So this is, which of the following is the cheapest purchase? And each one of them may or may not have math, but you certainly will have to look something up. So don't try to keep these in mind or remember them. One of them says an adult half-day pass on a Monday. So half-day passes are over here. Monday would be a weekday, but it doesn't look like with a half-day pass that it matters. Adults are the first ones, so that is going to be 18. So I'm going to write that down. And then child, full day pass on a Saturday. So a full day on a Saturday is going to be here. A child is here. So that's going to be 20. Adult with a 2-year-old full day pass on a Friday. Since this says Saturday, Sunday, Friday must be a weekday. You have an adult and a 2-year-old. So the adult is 20. The 2-year-old is actually free because it says children under 3 are free. So it's just going to be that 20. And then a senior citizen full day pass on a Wednesday. So that's going to be 17. And if it's wanting cheapest, that's going to be D. That could have been worse. That one wasn't too bad. The only time that these are bad are if they have you adding things together, which they often do, and if you're not keeping track of them and writing them down. So never try to just keep one of them in your head. Never try to do it where you're like, okay, so this is the cheapest. Okay, now that's replaced by that. So take that out of the running. Okay, now it's this one. Never try to do that. Always have like a little grid ready to go. This says that there's 2 questions. The other one was removed to make space for better things, so don't worry about that. The next passage is Blue Cats. This is a sort of real passage. Again, I made this passage, but it is modeled off of a passage that is very confusing and causes a lot of anger on the test. So pay very close attention to what these answers are because you're probably not going to like them. So this is essentially like a descriptive, informative passage. What type of writing is shown here, believe it or not, is informative. I realize that this sounds like either it's persuasive or if you think the way I think, you feel like it sits right on the line between informative and persuasive because it sounds almost opinionated. And I'll tell you why it sounds almost opinionated. There's not an opinion. They're not like, these are the best cats. These are the coolest cats that you can have, or you should get this cat, right? So it's not that opinionated, but they're also not saying they're brown, they're about 7 inches tall, they jump this high. Like, it's also not a statistical description. So they're choosing very subjective ways of describing these cats that seem favorable to them, right? So essentially what you have is you have an informative with a favorable tone. So you have somebody who's informing you about these cats who has favor toward the cats. So they're using words like thoughtful, intelligent, reserved, can be trained easily. I mean, trained easily is not opinionated. That could be very well kind of sort of proven. But things like intelligent, thoughtful, those are things that are certainly not opinions because they're not saying they're the best or the worst or anything like that. That is still going to fall into the category of inform. Before you send me a text and ask me this, yes, I am absolutely 100% positive that that is answered in form. So that is in form, which means that your next part, because it's always in a 2-part, is going to be to explain the properties of a certain type of cat or something like this. I don't remember the actual wording of the answer, but what I can tell you is there's 2 questions typically with this one. One of them is a very basic purpose question that's like, what type of writing is it? And it's to inform, to explain, one of those. I don't remember if it's to inform or to explain. They probably have both on different questions. And then the other will have the sentence that says like to explain the Russian blue cat or to describe blah, 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 that type of answer. And it will either have to explain or to inform about the Russian blue cat or about the certain type of cat. So if you read that and you felt like you were right on the fence, which is how I felt the first time I read it, you now know that you can push yourself onto one side of the fence or the other, push yourself onto the informative or expository side of the fence. Left-handed, if you've ever seen this passage, you were also potentially really torn about it. Again, I totally wrote this, so it's not really word for word. It's not probably even close, but it's kind of got the same type of structure, same content. This is a really strange passage because these are both kind of passages that seem like they ought to be like an entire essay. And instead of an entire essay, they're just like a couple of quick sentences and they try to cover several paragraphs worth of info really quickly. And it blurs the main idea and the purpose and stuff like that when they do that. So that makes these particularly hard and it makes it kind of difficult to figure out what the purpose or the passage type or the main idea is. On this one, the main idea is that the hand that someone dominantly uses does not actually affect their life. If you were torn, so you might have thought that was it, you might have been dead set that it was that one. And if you weren't dead set that that was the one, you might have been torn between that and the fact that there's been a lot of research about mixed handed people, because right at the end, it starts to sound like maybe that's what they're getting at. And then when you get to the second question, which asks you for the detail that supports it, they give you a good detail for this one, and they give you a good detail for this one. So whichever one you liked, and it really stinks if you were torn because they gave you a good one for each, they have a good one for it. So the one that goes with the right answer, which is the fact that your dominant hand doesn't affect your life, is that the chances of being left-handed is random. So if it's completely random what hand you write with, then it doesn't affect your life. It's not like certain types of people are left-handed, so it's not affecting anything else in your life. So that means in the case of the way I put the letters, because they're totally random, I ended up with B and then B again. If you had picked the mixed-handed one, you would have ended up with the detail that says, research shows remarkable differences between normal and mixed-handed people. So they had a good detail to go with each. If you were torn, the mixed-handed thing, had they just put a couple more sentences about it, then you might have shifted your focus. They didn't put quite enough, so it is safe to say that the focus of that passage was still supposed to be that being left-handed did not affect other things about your life. On to the hummingbirds passage. This is not an official current passage. It is ATI official, but it is not in the current rotation of the test. So this was for your practice. I'll give you the answers quickly to this one. 32 should be D. This is asking for a similar theme, which is another way of saying what else could you structure similarly when you do your critical strategy and you break it all down. What else could have a breakdown that looks like your breakdown? That would be D. 33 is B. So a couple of these were obvious, like a citation from an archaeologist. You would have to have a hummingbird that had been dead and buried for many, many thousands of years for an archaeologist to be involved. Migration would not be relevant. And then a citation from a pamphlet on the wildlife of Florida would be too general. Like, wildlife of Florida is so big and broad that they would not be able to really talk much about any one animal. So that's why it's not that one. So a citation from a zoologist, they would be able to really speak to any one particular animal because their job is to know everything about every particular animal. 34, which of the following statements contains only facts? That would be D. This is from reading 6. I'm not doing a great job of labeling what class they come from, but a lot of them in this class don't have one particular place that they come from either. 35, which of the following best rephrases the topic of the passage? The wide variety of hummingbirds and their attributes. The way that I outlined this passage, my first paragraph, I wrote hummingbirds, tiny, lots of kinds, fast, amazing. So that was what I got out of my intro. My second paragraph, I wrote the smallest kind, the largest kind, but they're all tiny. They all have tons of agility and speed. The third paragraph was completely about the ruby-throated. It was all focused on that one. The fourth was about all hummingbirds and how they eat insects and nectar and how feeders will supplement their diet and how they migrate. And then they have speed, agility, and beauty. So it was truly just about the different types and what they're like in general. Which of the following best summarizes the passage? Is going to be D. They are marvels of speed, agility, and beauty. The two that you might have been torn between, or the maybe three that you might have been torn between, is C, so C is when you think of a hummingbird, you most likely think of a very small creature with furiously beating wings. This talks about their size and the fact that they're fast. So it's got the speed and then their size, but it doesn't have beauty. So you've got more in D. And this is what I'm saying is when you do a summary and you're trying to figure out the best summary, you want the one that has the most different things that are being summarized. So if you only have two things, especially if they're two things that are less emphasized or less important, then you want to take it out. Being the only birds that can fly backwards is only one thing. That would leave you at B and D. B is just size. All that's talking about is being the smallest bird. So you've got one that just talks about size, one that just talks about flight, one that talks about size and speed, and then you've got one that talks about speed, agility, and beauty, and that's going to be your best one. 37 is supposed to be C. In the third paragraph, they talked about the male ruby-throated defending their food source. So you can infer that they would attack to do so. Which of the following describes the structure of the passage, provides facts about hummingbirds? 39, what is the main purpose in the third paragraph? To inform, more specifically, to inform about ruby-throated. So that was the paragraph that was specifically focused on one particular type. And then the last one on that one, which of the following statements from the passage provides evidence that hummingbirds have the capacity to amaze? So in other words, if you're trying to say that they are amazing, what would be the best thing you could say? The ones that I took out first were B and D. So the fact that people hang feeders doesn't do much in the way of saying that they're amazing. The fact that they are the only kind, a certain kind is the only kind, is not that amazing. That would leave me, despite their small stature, they can do incredible things, and their wings beat faster than any other bird, 60 to 70 times per second. Both of those are impressive, but if I say that somebody does incredible things versus if I cite a very, very specific incredible thing, being specific is much more impressive than just being general. So that's like if I say, hey, I have this dog that does some really impressive things, and you say to me, oh, cool, like what? And I'm just like, oh, really incredible things. You're like, yeah, cool. Versus if I say, oh, it can skateboard, you're going to be a lot more impressed if I can say that my dog can skateboard than if I just say it does incredible things. So anytime you can give a specific example, that is always a better detail, better evidence. You'll always get a recipe. It will always be technical. I'm skipping ahead a bit to question 43. Remember that a lot of times they don't give you the technical option. This time I did, because a lot of times this is your final mock. The reading mock 5 for a lot of you is the last one. Remember that technical actually is what a recipe is. So hopefully they will give you technical so you can answer that question right. If they don't, you can answer it expository, but it is supposed to be technical. That is the real right answer. To go back up to 41, which of the following actions should the cook take first when following the recipe? Drain and rinse the beans, choice D. What other action would be taken around the same time as the previous answer? And that would be A, mince the garlic or chop the onions. They want the tomatoes not to be drained. You don't want to include something you already said you were going to do is the problem with C, because you already drained the beans in the previous step. And then D has something that we don't do as well. The next one has a bunch of definitions for the verb cut, and then says which of the following uses is shown here. She cut her explanation off short. That is to cut, to reduce the size, extent, or duration of, which is F, and that is answer choice D. This ad for a home, the intention of an ad is always to persuade, even if an ad doesn't come across like it's telling you to do something or telling you to go somewhere. If it's an advertisement of any kind, it is persuasive. That doesn't include, like, if there's a publication that says like new clinic opening Monday and it's just telling you what the address is, what time it opens, but it's not like come check it out. If it's like a clinic or something that's not a business that's trying to profit off of you, that would be different. But if it's an ad for anyone who's making money, anybody who's having a sale, anything like that, definitely it is persuasive. That would be an opinion piece at the very least. Sentence 1 and 2 are an example of blank, while sentence 3 and 4 are an example of blank. These aren't perfect, but I felt like this was a really good example, a really good place for you to practice your structure a little bit. So sentence 1 and 2 are, do you want to maximize the value of your home? Our company offers a manual showing which upgrades to a home provide the greatest return, which I don't know why there's a grammar error in that, but so maximize the value of your home, offers a manual showing upgrades to provide the greatest return. Ignore the grammar error in that. And then the next part is, when you register with one of our agents, the guide is free. So what they're getting at here is that sentence 1 and 2 is problem and solution. They're not saying that maximize the value of your home is a problem. They're saying it's something you're wanting to achieve, and they're calling it a problem for that reason. And the solution is that the company offers a showing to upgrade. So problem, solution, followed by cause, effect. So this one, if you register with an agent, then you get a guide for free. So this is the cause, this is the effect. So you have problem, solution, and then cause, effect. And then you have another recipe. I wrote this one differently just to give you some different practice. So what is the passage type? It is technical. How many steps must be taken before you complete the first bullet point? The bullet point is there. There's actually 4. So you chop that, you drain and rinse that, and that would be D, which is 4. You will get absolutely one of these where you have to edit a word like this. There'll always be one of those. So TTT PPYU, it says remove all vowels. I don't know why this doesn't have a number next to it. This should say 1, 2, 3. If that was confusing, sorry, because I don't know why it doesn't have the little instruction thing. So remove the vowels. There's only one vowel, which is U. Remove the first T and last T. Change the letter P to the letter C. So there's 2 of those. And then that's it. So bring down your other letters and you'll end up with choice C, T, C, C, Y. And then you've got a chart. This is very similar to a chart that I just saw the other day where somebody had like their running times. So it says this is her daily running chart. Each day is shown in miles per hour, minutes per mile, and calories burned. Based on the minutes it took her, so that's the middle column, minutes per mile, to run her mile each day, and assuming she runs the same distance every day, on which day did she have the shortest run? They're not asking you to look through this entire gigantic list. You can only pick from those ones. So out of the ones that they have listed, which in this case are very random, which of those 4 would have been her shortest run? So day 10 was 8 minutes. Day 7 was 10. Day 5 was 12. And day 1 was 20. So out of those, it was 10. We don't know for sure that she only runs 1 mile. So it could have taken her, instead of 8 minutes, it might have been 16 minutes. But we're assuming that however long she ran, it was proportional every day. We're going to assume that again on the next one. So assuming again that she always does the same distance so that the times relate to each other the same way. Which of the following were Lucy's fastest 2 days? And again, we have certain options that we have to look at. The way that I did this to do it really fast is I looked and I said day 11 and 12. So 11 was 7:30 and then 12 was 7:04. And I added those together like they were just numbers in the hundreds. So that would be 14:34. And then day 12 is 7:04. Day 13 is 6:40. I added those together. I did all this in my head. So can you. And then I did the next two was 6:40, 6:19. So I just added them together so that I could see the totals. And then 6:19. And you might have noticed that you can kind of glance at this one. You want to have at least written down this part. You might have noticed that each day she gets faster. So if you did notice that day by day she keeps getting faster, you might have realized that the very last 2 days were going to be the 2 that she would be the fastest. That's fine. If you didn't do this, that's all right. Either way, you should have ended up at D. She would be the fastest at D. And last one, you're always going to get a pie chart with percentages like this. It's always going to ask you either 1 or 2 questions that asks you what's true or what's not true about something. Your answers on this are going to be C for 52 and A for 53. So on 52, more money is spent on housing than on food and drink. Those are the same. Those 2 numbers have the same percentage. More money is spent on housing. Housing is 20%, and then household expenses is 15. Combined, those 2 are 35. So it says more money is spent on those 2 combined than is spent on all of the others. That would be dead wrong because housing and household expenses is 35 combined. All the others would be how it would add up to 100, which is 65. So that would not be right. More money is spent on clothes and transport, which is 25, than hobbies and medical care, which is 15. So the way to do this is to just write the little numbers down as you're going along. The last one says more money is spent on travel and healthcare. So that's 10. Than is spent on clothes, which is 10. Again, those are the same, so you can't say more. On 53, I did the same thing. Costs for travel, which is 5. Hobby, which is 10. Medical care, which is 5. Combined, so 5, 10, and 5 is 20, are equal to the costs of food and drink, which is 20. That's how I get that that's a yes. And I did the same thing for the next one. Costs of food and drink, which is 20, plus travel, which is 5, are less than costs for housing. No, because this would be 25 combined together. That's 20. So just get sort of quick at that and you're good on those. I don't think any of you really have a lot of trouble making those comparisons and making those statements. It's just a matter of having a good little spot on your scratch paper for them and getting kind of quick at making those little math things happen and making those comparisons. If you have any particular questions, let me know. Like I said, there's some really weird examples in this one. Most of the things I went over in this one are kind of weird examples, and they're in there because they really are things that you may run into. So although some of those were weird and awkward and are on the test, you've now seen them, especially if you've gone across all of the different mocks. You have now been exposed to most of the weird things that you will see, and you are hopefully understanding what's weird and why it's weird and what to expect. And even if you're not getting every single thing right, hopefully you've seen them and you remember them, and that's another avenue for you to get those right. So if there's specific questions, let me know, and I will see you guys later.